by way of introduction, is just to try and frame some of the issues that we're going to be talking about over the next couple of days with the presentations, without having heard the presentations, so I might be completely misguided there. But it's clearly very important to be talking about justice and climate transitions here in this city as we approach the COP21 negotiations later on in the year. And the goal of this event is to deepen our understanding about what it means to have a just transition, a just climate transition. And we'll be doing this by considering some of the philosophical and sociological insights and frameworks that go towards framing a just climate transition. And what I want to do in my opening remarks is just try and put some of these issues in a context which I hope will be useful. So to begin with a very philosophical manoeuvre, what do we mean when we talk about climate transitions? What kind of things are we referring to? And very obviously, what people often mean by when they talk about climate transitions is the transition in terms of moving from high carbon society to a low carbon society, usually involving a transition to renewable energy. This seems to be the most common thing that people often refer to. And this very obviously, as you'll all know, will involve positive measures such as designing new stationary energy, new types of stationary energy generation, new grids, new methods of finance and so on to enable these kind of pieces of infrastructure to be put in place. And negatively, what people often seem to refer to are things such as removing subsidies to fossil fuel industries, changing people's behaviour, putting constraints and constrictions on the kind of things that, kind of choices that people are allowed to make, as well as various savings and efficiency issues that commonly are associated with climate transitions, whether it's improving our building stock and so on. More broadly, when people talk about climate transitions, they often mean not just the energy sector, but perhaps transport or building and various other city-wide or country-wide kind of measures that are often included in discussions about climate transitions. Moreover, it's very important, I think, to note that transitions have a scope. So they have a temporal scope, which can refer to whether or not the transition is for this generation or it's for the next generation, or sometimes the scope is referred to in terms of a set year. So people say that we will transition by this date, 2020, 2030, 2040, or whatever it happens to be. So there's a temporal scope. Obviously, there's a geographical scope. So transitions are sometimes just discussed in terms of one country or all countries or a region. And of course, they have an ambition. So transitions typically are set at perhaps reducing carbon by 100%, or maybe it's 80%, or maybe it's less. So there's a determinate ambition that usually goes with transitions. But as I've been reading much of the literature about this, there's that kind of goal which seems to be aimed at reducing carbon. And then there's broader goals that people talk about. So in my own country, in Australia, there were insulation measures introduced in order to provide an economic stimulus to the country as a result of the economic crisis. People often say that there are these broader co-benefits, such as stimulating the economy, perhaps improving people's health by removing the health impacts of coal, for instance, avoiding conflict, or indeed cutting down costs in various ways. These kind of co-benefits are often mentioned as part of the goals of a climate transition. And I think these kind of goals point towards a kind of way in which we can characterise climate transitions. So how I've spoken about it to date is, or in the preceding remarks, tells us that there are really a couple of ways that we might characterise a climate transition. One is by whether it reduces carbon, whether it's carbon focused, if you like. Another might be by the extent to which it embodies these other goals. And of course, the third way that we might talk about it is the way that we're going to talk about it over the coming days, is the way in which a climate transition embodies various goals related to justice. That seems to be a very important and, if you like, way in which that climate transitions have yet to be properly articulated. So we might characterise them according to these three headings that I've mentioned, because of the recognition that we have that climate justice is an integral part of thinking about climate transitions. And obviously the motivation for this is, if we look very broadly at the role of justice when we think about climate change in general, obviously working out what kind of harms or the ways in which climate change is dangerous it's an important moral issue. We have to work out why it is that it has a negative impact on us. Obviously, we have to work out simultaneously on whom these impacts are most keenly felt, what kind of agents or groups or indeed countries suffer the harms of climate change. And indeed, a third moral reason, a third way in which morality figures in the general discussion about climate change is looking at whether the kinds of responses to these harms or harms on particular groups is fair and just. That these are very general moral ways in which, these are very general ways in which morality in general is relevant to the topic of climate change. But there's more particular ways that the language of justice ought to be invoked when we're talking about transitions. As will, I think, become obvious as we're proceeding through these topics over the coming days, it's very clear that if nothing else, the problem of climate transitions is a problem, at least in part, of distributive justice. That's how philosophers would typically refer to it. Why is it so? Well, because any type of climate transition will distribute benefits and burdens between people, and these have to be distributed in a way that accords with a justifiable moral and political framework. So it's in a way a very obvious case of where distributive justice is relevant, because it will raise issues about the distribution of benefits and burdens, benefits being obviously things like having access to energy, low-cost sustainable energy, burdens being most obviously having to do with cost, but there are many other burdens as well, as people will point out. But it seems, even though justice is clearly implicated in this distributive sense, there's a broader sense in which justice is relevant for talking about climate transitions. And this seems to be derived from the way in which, because climate transitions are so important to our well-being, if we're going to avoid dangerous climate change, it seems very plausible to argue that it ought to be cohere with our broader justice-based goals that we have when we talk about justice in a broader social or country type setting. And what I mean by that is that it seems plausible to argue that there ought to be a framework that has positive and negative dimensions set up such that we can evaluate and pursue a climate transition that tells us something about how we ought to be constrained, the negative dimension, so how we ought to modify our behaviour, what kind of harms are permitted or not permitted, and more positively, and this is, I guess, the more controversial end that we'll be discussing, what kind of other goals ought a climate transition have? So should it be aiming, for instance, to decrease inequality or increase equality, rather, if it's a positive aim? Should it aim to redistribute wealth? Should it aim to correct past wrongs in various ways, whether these are between countries with a colonial history perhaps, or as a result of poor distributions of wealth in other ways? people, as you will know, have argued that climate transitions ought to have a role in increasing autonomy, whether it's autonomy over a basic part, important part of your life, or perhaps it ought to increase participation and other democratic goals in the sense of allowing people to participate in decision making about important types of infrastructure or important public goods, which energy most obviously is. So these broad ways in which justice is raised, I think, shows the importance of the topic that we'll be dealing with over the next couple of days. And I think it shows that justice excuse me, is at the heart of our concerns about what a climate transition ought to look like. And the papers that will to come over the next couple of days will obviously take up these issues in various ways, whether it's mapping disadvantage in various ways, looking at the right to energy that people will have, analysing the dangers that go along with various types of climate transitions, or indeed looking at new forms of ownership and control that go with setting up new energy and other types of infrastructure. And it seems to me that there is clearly a gap insofar as I perceive it, in the literature and the debate about our transition to a low-carbon future. And that gap is what kind of principles of justice ought to guide the climate transitions that various NGOs or countries or people in general propose. And that obviously is a gap we wish to fill to some degree in what's going to follow. So just to summarise, according to what I've said here, we can characterise various climate transitions by the sense that in which they're carbon-focused or other goal-focused or indeed justice-focused. Now, in reality, these transitions are a mixture of all three, but it seems to me a useful way of characterising these types of transitions. So I've spoken very generally about what it is that what the relevance of justice is for talking about climate transitions, and other people will take up in much more interesting detail the particular dimensions of climate transitions that I've mentioned just then. But just in closing, I thought I'd mention one in particular, which partly accords with the kind of research that I myself is doing. And this is what I call the problem of legitimacy and justification. People will have other ways of framing it. Because it seems to me one of the largest issues that communities and societies face when we talk about climate transition is the sense in which any particular measure that goes along with a climate transition has a degree of legitimacy and justification. What do I mean by that? Well, we want of a climate transition that it have a degree of legitimacy, that we want it to be endorsed in some way by the people that it affects and the people who may be involved in it and indeed who pay for it. And we also want it to be justified. We want it to be morally appropriate. We don't want it to cross we don't want it to fall foul of any kind of moral principles that we think generally ought to guide these kind of rollouts of new infrastructure or new ways of living. And to think about it in this way, if we were able to introduce the most efficient and climate-friendly transition we could simply by imposing it on people, it would lack a very important dimension of justice. So it would lack the endorsement that gives it legitimacy. So we want that dimension to be satisfied. Similarly, if we were to just introduce a transition that was the product perhaps of an aggregate of people's opinions in some way, then that perhaps wouldn't have the sense of justification that we normally demand of large-scale social transformations. So it seems to me that one of the problems that we face when we're talking about justice and climate transitions, is how do we balance these two elements of legitimacy and justification? And we see this all the time in my own neck of the woods, in my own country, when we're introducing wind farms or not introducing them, as the case may be, these issues of legitimacy and justification are in fact front and centre of the debate, and I believe it's true elsewhere. But that's just an elaboration on one dimension of the principles of justice that might inform a climate, a sense of justice and climate transitions. Other people will take that up in different language and in different ways. But I've just tried to put some of the frameworks and some of the key ideas in which some of the papers I think will sit in the days to come. And our challenge, I think, is to try and reflect on and articulate principles that ought to guide these debates about justice and climate transition, which is a very large debate, but we've got till 5 p.m. tomorrow, so I think that ought to enable us to have ample time. And at that point, I might just stop, I think, because that's enough by way of introduction. And I think I might just ask the first speaker, Professor John O'Neill, Holsworth Professor of Political Economy at the University of Manchester.